As the state's leading property and casualty insurance trade association, the Wisconsin Insurance Alliance plays a crucial role in safeguarding Wisconsinites. Alliance members provide vital insurance coverage, ensuring financial protection for individuals, businesses, and communities across the state. In times of need, they act as a reliable resource, helping residents recover from unforeseen events. Ultimately, the Wisconsin Insurance Alliance and its members contribute to the resilience and well-being of Wisconsin families and businesses by offering essential protection and support. WisI video of the WisPolitics Madison Luncheon series at the Madison Club is made possible with sponsorship support from the Wisconsin Insurance Alliance.
You might have to move the mic, but you can calibrate that.
Yeah. Okay, everyone, we're about to get started. Thanks very much. I'm Jeff Mayers from WisPolitics.com here with the June edition of the WisPolitics Luncheons at the Madison Club. Thanks very much for attending. First of all, I want to thank our sponsors for this continuing series of events. You can see them behind me here. WC Energy Group, Walmart, ARP Wisconsin. Thanks, Jimmy and the gang. Wisconsin Insurance Alliance, which sponsors the Wisconsin Eye video. American Family Insurance. XL Energy. Thank you, Matt and the group. And HB Strategies. Thank you, Matt and Brian and company. HB Strategies has been with us from the beginning under some various names, various different names, but thank you for sticking with us. And now this is where you wildly applaud for the sponsors. Sponsors, I tried to get wild applause. I did not get wild applause. We're just warming people up here. Okay. What's going on in July and August? Well, I didn't have anything scheduled for July and August. I thought we should schedule something for September on will the budget pass. So, wow. My jokes are bad or my timing is bad or both. Okay. So anyway, if you have suggestions for events for the fall, please let me know. We do have a polling summit scheduled for September 25th. Not part of this series, but it will be here on September 25th. We're going to focus on rural politics, which is a good thing to do, I think, before the election year next year. I want to also introduce a special guest, Eugene. Pay attention now, Eugene. Eugene's from the consulate in Chicago for Taiwan. And he's getting a new assignment, but he's a frequent guest here. So let's hear it for Eugene. Okay, so now we're going to have a program. We go about an hour. Questions from you after I get done with my questions. Your questions are always better than my questions, so try to keep up the good work. Let me introduce our special guest today, Attorney General Josh Kaul, everyone. Clap. You've had absolutely nothing to do in the first part of the year. How do you justify even being an Attorney General? But how does this compare? Okay, so you're in your second term. This has to be extraordinary times for you.
It is. We were very active in my first 2 years in office in federal litigation challenging actions of the Trump administration, but the pace at which things are going right now is very different. And I think that's a reflection of a very different Trump administration than we saw in President Trump's first term. I know we'll talk a lot more about that in a few minutes, but the extent to which this administration is extremely aggressively asserting executive power and control over a sweeping range of topics is unlike anything we've seen, certainly in recent memory and probably in American history. And as a result of that, particularly with a Republican Congress that has been largely supportive of the president, a lot of the action that's happening right now is cases involving state AGs around the country and litigation. I believe we currently have 11 separate cases, 11, where we have orders in place, multi-state cases were involved, orders either fully or partially blocking different Trump administration actions. In 2 cases, we got orders, but then they were subsequently stayed. And then there are a handful of cases where we are awaiting a trial court order. So in just a few months, really, we've had a huge range of litigation.
Okay, so what's the total you're involved in? I want to calculate your batting average.
Yes, well, we're in 20 cases. There's an asterisk, which is one of those cases we filed a petition. It hasn't really started yet. So 19 basic lawsuits, and then this one case with a petition. But of those, like I said, 11 of them we've got an order. 2 of them we got an order, but it was stayed. And then the other cases we are awaiting initial decisions, and they're in different phases.
Okay, so how many, do you know this number? How many nationally cases filed by states against Trump orders or Trump directives?
I don't know the exact number. There are some cases that other states are involved in that we're not. In a lot of the cases we're involved in, many states are involved, but some aren't. And in some instances, like with birthright citizenship, there are actually multiple cases where states are involved in challenging policies. And it's important to note that the cases involving the states, while they're very important, are just a fraction of the overall cases challenging actions of the administration. There are hundreds of cases challenging different actions that have been taken. In some of them, we've joined amicus briefs that support a particular party's position in the case. And that's on top of the 20 or so cases we talked about.
How do you decide, because it could be a lawsuit an hour, let alone a lawsuit a day. I mean, how do you say, well, we're going to jump in on this one? Do you have a team at the DOJ?
Yeah, we have folks at DOJ who are looking at these cases. I guess to go back a step, we have worked closely with other AGs around the country, both in preparing for this administration and then in responding to actions the administration has taken. Some of the things that have happened are things we fully expected. So as an example, the president made clear that he was going to seek to restrict birthright citizenship. And on his first day in office, he issued an executive order that restricted birthright citizenship. We were prepared for that. He was clear about that. And the next day, that we filed a multi-state suit challenging that action. And right now, his efforts to deny citizenship to some kids born in the U.S. have been blocked. In other cases, there is stuff that I don't think anybody knew was going to happen. So Elon Musk, for instance, going from agency to agency and getting access to confidential and private data is not something that I think anybody anticipated. But that's a case where we went to court regarding his access or Doge's access to Treasury data. And there are basically 2 things that I look at in deciding whether to join a multi-state case. One is this a policy that is harmful to Wisconsinites? There are lots of policies the Trump administration issues that I disagree with, but some of them may not directly impact Wisconsinites. And if that's the case, that's not a case we would get involved in. Secondly, do we have a strong legal basis for a challenge? I think you can tell from our success rate. We've been good about selecting those cases. We have consistently been getting favorable rulings when district courts have ruled on these cases. But there's no purpose in wasting resources. One thing that is an important nuance there is, again, there are a lot of policies the Trump administration issues. But we don't have standing, a legal basis to get into court in all of those cases. In fact, in many of those cases. So there may be an immigration decision, for instance, that's been very high profile and in the news, but it doesn't harm Wisconsin as an entity, a state agency, or cause the state to expend resources. And if that's the case, we can't get into court in the first place. We don't have standing. So that limits where we can get involved and also impacts when we decide to get involved.
Okay, so I'm going to start with one in particular, and then we can go from there. But yesterday, so the UW Madison chancellor ordered a 5% cut, a budget cut, in part because of the curtailment of the NIH grants under the president's administration. So now there's been a recent court order freeing up or blocking the curtailment of them, but from what I read, a lot of researchers still waiting to know what's happening to the money. So can you shed light on that case and how you think it's impacting UW?
Yeah, well, let me talk about the case specifically first, but I think it also touches on a broader point that's important. So we have multiple cases now against specific actions that HHS has taken, the Department of Health and Human Services. 2 of them specifically relate to National Institute of Health grant actions. So in one of them, despite the fact that there were agreements between universities and research institutions all over the country and the federal government to provide a certain reimbursement rate for research, the Trump administration came in and said, unilaterally, we're imposing a different rate that would result in a pretty significant cut. The impact at UW-Madison would have been about $65 million per year. That's a case where we filed suit and we got an order blocking that cut from going into effect. Separately, they have also tried to cancel existing grants. So grants that had been awarded to people, they've said, even though we awarded that and you're mid-grant, we're going to cancel that. That's a different case where we also got an order preventing the cancellation of those grants, and that's millions of dollars at stake for UW-Madison there as well. But in the meantime, what's happened is a lot of uncertainty for folks who are the folks doing the research as part of these grants, and there's a lot of concern about what's going to happen in the future for two reasons. One is we have the administration, and this is part of one of our challenges, changing the process in place. There's a very complex, thorough, rigorous process for the awards of grants, and the administration has come in and interfered with that process, and that may impact the continuation of grant fundings and leave it up in the air whether the kinds of grants that would normally continue are going to continue. And then secondly, there is the federal legislation, the budget bill, that's under consideration, which could also significantly change what's being done. Because our argument in those cases fundamentally is that the president is ignoring laws passed by Congress. The reason that's our argument is because that's what he's doing. There are laws passed by Congress that provide for specific reimbursement, specific approaches, and there's even a provision that says the president can't unilaterally change it. Despite that, the president has done that. But if Congress passes a new law that changes the parameters, well, then our argument has been defanged, and then researchers will be in a much more difficult position. So UW is dealing with all that uncertainty as they need to plan ahead for their budget, not to mention the fact that there's also the state budget that could impact them, and there's also all the normal uncertainty that goes into the budgeting process. The broader point, and this is one of the things I think is interesting from these cases, and you can increasingly see it, is one of the real themes from this administration is there is a concerted attack on fundamental programs that people have relied on and that have had bipartisan support for a long, long time. One area we see that very clearly is in public health and healthcare research. In addition to these NIH cuts, there was an effort to cut about $11 billion in public health funds. Of course, we're on the precipice of potentially having major cuts to Medicaid. And we are really on the verge of a dark ages in American medical research and public health if what this administration is trying to do moves forward. Because this is research that is life-saving, makes a difference in people's lives, that again has wide support, but is now facing major, major cutbacks.
Okay, the dark ages. So I think, the Trump administration isn't here to counter your argument, but they might call that hyperbole.
Well, the facts speak for themselves, And look, we've got RFK Jr. As the secretary at HHS, who has changed the way vaccines are even being issued. This is a basic, fundamental part of our public health infrastructure. All that is under attack right now from this administration. And you can't cut $11 billion in public health grants. You can't drastically cut research funding. You can't kick people off of Medicaid without having enormous impacts. Medicaid is one, by the way, where I think it's important to highlight. It certainly will impact folks who are on Medicaid, and we'll see if there are cuts with Medicare as well. But there are going to be much broader systemic impacts as well, because hospitals rely on that revenue to stay open. And so we are in a place right now where we've got hospitals struggling to stay open, particularly in rural areas. If these kind of cuts go through, we could see closures and dramatic reductions in access for people. That's what we're on the verge of right now. And one of the untold stories in this administration is how close we are to having major setbacks when it comes to public health. Because there's so much going on with this administration, it's hard to keep focused on any one topic. But I think this is a really important one.
Okay, so of all the actions you're in and all the actions maybe you anticipated getting in, is there one that is most egregious in your view, or that is like you said, there's a flurry of legal action here, hard to track. So is there one though that stands above the others, other than public health?
Yeah, well, again, it's hard to choose. One area I would say is really critically important is pretty early on, the Trump administration tried to freeze federal funding for a 60-day period. And that would have had truly catastrophic effects. This is funding that goes to just about everything imaginable, but including law enforcement agencies that are in Wisconsin working to conduct multi-jurisdictional enforcement efforts, as well as numerous other actions that the federal government funds. There would have been major consequences if that had gone into effect. Fortunately, we got an order blocking that, but that would have significantly destabilized a number of different industries. We saw some impacts with Head Start programs, for example, and with Meals on Wheels, but that order blocked a lot of the harm that could happen. And that's really one of the stories from these cases is, there's a big announcement from the president about an executive order, and it's on all the news channels, and it gets lots of attention. But in a lot of these cases, it's then blocked. It doesn't actually happen. That tends to get a lot less coverage. But those orders are critically important to preventing some of the harm that has happened from this administration. They can't prevent all the harm, but they have been an important part of limiting the damage to this point.
So there's federal money that comes into state DOJ. So, is anything that has occurred in D.C. affecting your agency right now?
So far, there have been some changes that have had some impact on us, but so far, the more significant changes have been in other areas. We talked about public health. That's certainly a big one. Another area where I think we're seeing really big impacts relates to education. Two areas I'll mention there where we've got suits. One involves the effort to dismantle the Department of Education. One of the president's executive orders was to effectively shut down the Department of Education to the extent possible. And the Department of Education does all sorts of things that are critical to educational programs in the country. For example, they administer the FAFSA program for student aid, the application form that's used. They administer Pell Grants. They ensure that civil rights laws are enforced in schools. So that's one area where there could be major cuts. We again have an order blocking the action with the Department of Education. And then there was a condition put on grant compliance, and so funds to Wisconsin are being threatened if there's not a certain certification submitted by DPI. And that's over $500 million a year that's at stake for kids in Wisconsin, for educational programs. So that's another area we've seen major potential damage being done from cuts that the administration has made.
Okay. Have you been getting pressure from the feds on immigration?
Well, obviously, publicly, what the feds are doing is very clear. At the Department of Justice, our investigators focus on investigating crimes of statewide importance. We are focused on some of the most significant crimes in Wisconsin, some of the most high-profile cases. That can be large-scale drug trafficking, it could be homicides, arson, fraud.
We have a case here in Madison that's making national news, right? The poisoning.
That's right. DCI was involved in the case that was recently charged, and I'll note I can't comment on that. It's an ongoing case, and the defendants are presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. A charge is just an accusation. But
I think you got it covered there. Go ahead.
We are involved in enforcing the criminal laws. We are not an immigration enforcement agency, so our focus is on public safety, and that's where it has been, and that's where it will remain.
Okay, but in our state, in Milwaukee Circuit Court, a judge was basically perp walked because of a ICE accusation. What message do you take from that?
Well, because it's a pending federal criminal case, I don't want to comment on the specifics of that. What I will say, though, with regard to the approach the administration is taking on immigration, is it is clearly counterproductive to public safety. So one of the things that Donald Trump said when he was a candidate was that he was going to go after people who were committing serious crimes. That was going to be the focus. But what we have seen instead is that a lot of the focus has been elsewhere. The incident in L.A., for instance, arose out of a raid at a Home Depot. These are people who are working in their community, not people who are committing crimes. We recently had a teacher's aide self-deport from Milwaukee. What's happening is the federal government is shifting resources away from investigating serious crime, investigating white-collar crime, for example, by FBI, investigating large-scale drug trafficking in some cases, and shifting resources over to immigration enforcement. And so we're seeing DEA agents involved in immigration. We're seeing FBI agents involved in immigration. And what that means is that those same agents are not investigating the most serious crimes our communities are facing. So I'm very concerned about the direction we're seeing at the federal level from a public safety standpoint, because it's undermining our ability to collaborate. We're also seeing an administration that is not collaborative with the states, and that is harmful to law enforcement as well. Law enforcement relies on partnerships, and we work closely with state, local, and federal partners to hold people accountable for serious crimes. What this administration is doing is taking us in the wrong direction on public safety issues by diverting those resources.
Okay, have you been surprised by any immigration actions the feds have taken in Wisconsin? Like, I mean, did they notify you, hey, we're going to arrest Dugan?
One of the themes of this administration is the lack of communication they've had with state agencies, with partners. I'll give you an example. We talked before about the freeze of federal funding. Now, whatever you think about that policy, that's a big deal for the states, right? States are going to have to adjust to that if that actually goes through. It's going to have all sorts of implications for programs. If you're serious about governing, you coordinate with your partners on that to let them know that's coming. How did we learn about this freeze? There was an OMB memo issued that got posted to social media, and that's how we became aware of that. And that's a consistent thing we've seen throughout the course of this administration is political stunts that capture attention, that are not thought through, that are not coordinated with partners, and then we're left trying to respond to that. You know, think about the OMB memo. You may recall, this is now a few months ago, they put out that memo, and then within a couple days they rescinded the memo. And then the press secretary went on national TV and said, well, the memo's rescinded, but the policy is still in place. I don't know what that means to this day, but clearly the administration wanted to keep going forward with the policy. Again, fortunately, the order blocked it, so that resolved the uncertainty. But that's the kind of thing that states are dealing with and agencies are dealing with as we're trying to respond. So to go back to one of your earlier questions, when UW is trying to budget in the face of that environment, it's an incredibly difficult task. It's not unique to them. It's true of everybody. It's incredibly difficult because what's happening at the federal level is unpredictable, and there's very little communication.
Okay, so can you say, did they let you know that they were going to arrest Dugan?
We wouldn't comment on ongoing investigations, so it's not because of that specific case, it's just a topic we wouldn't comment on generally.
Okay, so you talk about mixed messages. So there was a time, I think it's like 10 days ago or whatever, where Trump, at the urging of the Ag Secretary, backed off of raids involving tourism businesses and ag businesses. And then that lasted a few days, I think. But have you seen evidence of those kind of raids in Wisconsin?
This is not something that we gather data on or we have any specific insight into. So I know what you all would know from what we've seen in the paper. There have not been, there certainly has not been news coverage. Tell me if I'm wrong. Of the kinds of things we saw, with the Home Depot, for instance, in LA. But there remains a lot of uncertainty. And one of the things that is really concerning about the approach, again, this is back to the same point, is I don't think anybody knows. And so it makes it very difficult to plan and to assess how businesses can expect for things to move forward because there's just so much uncertainty out there. And it's causing a lot of fear in communities. I mean, there are people who are, I've heard from folks who have been naturalized, for example, who are deeply concerned about what might happen to them. And apparently not without reason they're concerned because we've seen mistakes made by this administration in some high-profile cases. And so there's a lot of fear and uncertainty that's been created that I think is undermining of the strength and well-being of communities here and around the country.
Okay, so is there an alternative to enforcing immigration laws without what the administration is doing? I mean, you call them political stunts, but I think part of that, their theory, I guess, is that these high-profile stunts will deter people from wanting to come to the U.S. or maybe to force them into self-deportation.
Well, two things. First of all, you can enforce immigration laws without violating people's rights or without doing it in a way that leads you to mistaken conclusions. One of these cases, they admitted they made a mistake in, and that led to the Supreme Court ultimately being involved in the case. So doing it in a way that's thoughtful and respects due process is important. But secondly, prioritizing is what we ought to be doing. Having a focus that prioritizes the most significant cases that have the biggest impact on public safety is a way you can go about doing this rationally. There doesn't seem to be any coherent policy or approach to how the administration is approaching things. And they've used it for a lot of threats. I mean, Tom Homan sort of making a quasi-threat to the governor of Wisconsin at one point. This is not the kind of approach that is conducive to making our communities safer. So I hope that the administration will rethink it and have a more coherent, rational policy and be more collaborative with partners, but that has not been what we've seen so far.
Did Governor Evers do anything wrong in sending that directive to state agencies?
Absolutely not. I mean, it is the most basic thing to suggest that when law enforcement gets involved that you would talk to an attorney to figure out how best to respond. And it's really concerning. I mean, this is part of the politicization we've seen from this administration. But, they are making threats to try to intimidate people. They threatened Gavin Newsom not long ago. The mayor in Newark was arrested and then quickly let go. And it's part of a really disturbing pattern we are seeing from this administration, right? We've got threats against political opponents, and then we have the president in basically every direction looking to seize more power for himself. So he is ignoring acts of Congress openly, which is fundamentally inconsistent with our constitutional structure. They've certainly suggested that they may ignore court orders. There's a story today about a senior Department of Justice official raising that possibility. They're trying to force states to comply with them, threatening state officials, and then threatening to withhold funding that in some cases has nothing to do with the programs for which they're threatening to withhold funding if the states don't do what they say. And I think about this. The president has insisted on becoming the chair of the board of the Kennedy Center. He's trying to tell universities how to administer their programs. When you put all those pieces together, it is a sweeping effort to consolidate power into the hands of a single person. And it's fundamentally inconsistent with our constitutional design. It's part of the reason we keep winning these cases, because we are right on the law. But it's also something that we need to be attuned to and be prepared to push back on, because it is fundamentally inconsistent with the values that have made this country strong for centuries.
Okay, so moving now to the state Supreme Court. So there was a policy that was enacted in the early days of the Republican control of the legislature in terms of settlements made by DOJ had to be approved by the Joint Finance Committee, controlled by Republicans. So the state Supreme Court took that away. That must have made you feel pretty good, I think, right? I mean, but go ahead. Just tell me how you felt about that.
Well, first you haven't said what the vote was.
What was unanimous?
7-0.
Yeah.
That's right.
No. Oh, you like the unanimous ones. They mean even more, right? Of course. Okay.
Yeah, so right after Governor Evers and I were elected, you may recall, the legislature met in a special session to take certain authority away from us. And there has been long-running litigation related to that lame duck legislation. This case involved two significant categories of civil enforcement actions, or civil actions where we've brought a suit. In some cases, we've got authority to do it on behalf of DOJ. In other cases, an agency authorizes DOJ to bring the suit. And we were required to get approval from the Joint Finance Committee to settle those cases pursuant to part of one of those laws. In this case, so a couple examples would be if we bring an environmental enforcement action in a civil case, or we brought a consumer protection enforcement action. Under that law, we were required to get approval to resolve the case. And you can imagine how difficult it is to settle a case when you sit down with the opposing party and you say, we would like to resolve this case, but we can't tell you what the resolution will necessarily be, because we've got to go to a committee of the legislature to get approval from them to sign off on this. So parties that were settling with us had to sort of take a leap of faith. First, that their information, while the case was pending, they had to hope that it wouldn't be disclosed in a way that was inappropriate, and we were very conscious of that. But secondly, they could enter into a proposed settlement with us and potentially have it rejected by the legislature. That didn't end up happening, but that was the uncertainty that folks entered into. With this unanimous ruling, 7-0,
I get it now.
we are now able to resolve those cases without going to the Joint Finance Committee, which means environmental cases, consumer protection enforcement cases, where we've brought a civil action, we'll be able to get sure resolution. And think about an environmental case where we might have a supplemental environmental action they need to take. For example, somebody needs to make a change that helps protect the environment. This means that won't need to be delayed while this goes through the settlement process with joint finance, but can instead go into effect much more quickly.
Okay, so was this a mere annoyance, or was it like, did it really prevent you from, I mean, you're inferring that it really prevents you from negotiating, but I mean, did joint finance ever say hell no to something you negotiated?
Well, the short answer is no, but there's an important caveat, which is we've been in litigation in one form or another relating to this for most of the time I've been in office. And so the Joint Finance Committee largely, frankly, rubber stamped the proposals we sent over as this was going through the litigation process. But what it did is it gave them enormous power to get involved in settlements if they had chose to. That's not the way it played out in practice, and part of their argument in court was this is not really a problem, it's not interfering much. But had they interfered quite a bit, that would have changed the way those arguments unfolded. And what it would have done is allowed them to really control what settlements any attorney general entered into. And so that now has been struck down in those categories of cases.
Okay, so you talk about themes in your lawsuits against the Trump administration. There's some thematic things going on here, too. You've fought on appointment power. That one didn't turn out, I think, the way you wanted it. But then there's some on the partial veto power did, and I think there's one due tomorrow, too, on partial veto power. So you can't comment on that because you're worried that they'll switch their vote, or what? No, okay.
Tomorrow's, I believe, going to be on the DPI case, which has to do with funding and the release of funding. We just talked about, obviously, the recent case. But just today, this morning, there was a significant decision issued in a case involving DNR's authority to enforce the spill laws in connection with discharges of hazardous materials. This is really significant in the PFAS context because the argument that was made in this case is that the obligations that apply to the responsible party when there's a discharge of a contaminant like PFAS, a hazardous material, that those obligations didn't apply unless and until DNR put a rule in place finding that something was a hazardous material. So the court in this decision, 5-2 in this decision, rejected that argument and said, no, if it's a hazardous material, you have these obligations. DNR doesn't need to go through a rulemaking specifically finding that a substance is a hazardous material. That's a really important decision because had it gone the other way, it would have dramatically undermined DNR's ability to ensure that those who are responsible for hazardous material discharges were taking steps to clean those up.
Okay, so agreed. So anyway, though, I think what's going on here now, this is a tug of war between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and the court is the arbiter. And so some of this stuff is moving back toward the executive branch. So, Governor Evers already, any governor of Wisconsin, has one of the most powerful veto authorities in the country. I mean, is there too much, do you worry, I mean, you're an executive in a statewide elected official, but do you worry about that we might be moving too much in terms of executive power?
Well, what I'm concerned about is making sure that our separation of powers lines up with the way the Wisconsin Constitution is structured. And what I think we've seen in a series of cases decided recently now is that the court has found that it was not in line and that the legislature had aggrandized its power, taken too much power in a way that's inconsistent with separation of powers. And, there's a lot of talk about the court being divided 4-3, and
Today's decision was 5-2.
That's right. Certainly there will be 4-3 decisions over time. But one of the cases that stopped the legislative committees from blocking expenditures of funds by state agencies was a 6-1 decision, Evers versus Markline. This case we mentioned was 7-0. So I think it is clear that the court feels that having legislative committees, for example, blocking executive branch actions, at least with respect to funding, is impermissible. We've got a case pending right now that has to do with agency rulemaking, and so we'll have a decision in the next few weeks likely that will clarify whether legislative committees can block agencies from issuing administrative rules. So what is happening is we're restoring Wisconsin to a system that actually is much more like other states. It's unusual to have the kind of legislative committee vetoes that we have in Wisconsin, and we've seen through a few cases that being blocked, and we'll see what happens with the rulemaking case soon.
Okay, so before we go out to the audience, I'm going to ask you about your 2026 plans. Do you have any 2026 plans?
I don't have any announcements to make today, Jeff.
Why not? Aren't you here to make news?
We've got lots of topics we've covered, but no announcement today.
Okay, so Governor Evers may or may not run again. How would you counsel him?
That is a decision for Governor Evers to make. I think he's done a great job as governor, and like I said, no announcements from me today.
Well, okay. What if something happened? What if he didn't run? Would you be ready to run?
Any decisions we make will be ones that I announce in the future, Jeff.
So I'm treading on difficult territory. Is that it? But you did appear before the state party convention. What did you tell the state? But of course, you always do. But what did you tell them?
Well, we talked about some of the same topics we talked about today, frankly, which are what we have been doing to fight back against this administration, and also about some of the challenges that our republic faces right now with an administration that is not concerned with the rule of law or with our constitutional structure. And I think it's really important. Part of what's going on is happening in the courts, and that is an important forum. But it's also important that people are engaged on these topics because these are fundamental issues to how our government is structured. I have a view on them, but I think it's important that the public weighs in on these issues because whether we dramatically cut back funding to public health and health research, whether we dramatically weaken access to educational opportunity, whether we potentially kick millions of people off of health care, those are fundamentally important questions, as are questions about how our government is structured and whether we keep the separation of powers that have served this country so well over centuries. So, I encourage people to be involved in the process and to speak out because there's a lot at stake right now in the country. Okay, so,
a former, an AG, a sitting AG, got elected governor, Doyle. But I mean, you are kind of walking a different line than, if you're a legislator or a Congress member or, running for statewide office. I mean, how do you, personally, view, should I be careful getting involved in the, going to the convention? And you were also at the national convention in Chicago, hanging around the Wisconsin delegation. I mean, do you think you have to walk a finer line because, well, you're the state's top legal authority?
Yeah. So I think there is an important part of being an AG that there should be no difference whether you are a Democrat or Republican when it comes to enforcing our laws. If a law is violated, the identity of who the law is being enforced against should have no bearing on how we approach things. Now, I have different priorities than my predecessor did, and even though he and his predecessor were both in the same parties, they themselves probably had slightly different priorities. And so where you focus resources, that's something that there is legitimate debate on. And we're seeing that piece of it at the federal level. I disagree fundamentally with the Trump administration to put more resources towards immigration enforcement rather than enforcing criminal laws. But that's a policy decision that people in office have the authority to make. What they should not be doing, and what I'm deeply concerned about with the Trump administration, is not enforcing the laws in an even-handed fashion. And so when you talk about targeting political opponents, that's where it's inconsistent with the role. And so I think approaching what we do based on the law and based on the facts is vitally important to what we do. And I think our record speaks for itself on that. But I think anybody in my role, or frankly a DA's role or a sheriff's role, should be making sure they're even-handedly enforcing the laws.
Okay, well, let's throw it out there to the audience. Maybe you can make more progress on some of these than I can. Go ahead. Which is this case? Oh, okay. The question is, can you explain the difference between that and the SEIU case?
Yeah, so as I talked about...
Provide some good legal background for me.
I will. This is a long-running legal saga regarding the lame duck legislation. So the first case that it challenges to those laws arose in was called SEIU, the case you're referring to. That was a case challenging a number of different aspects of those laws. In some instances, the court found that the laws were impermissible and blocked them. In other cases, they said that the challenges were not successful. And specifically regarding this settlement issue, the one that one of the ones that has a big impact on us at DOJ, what the court there said was, you're arguing that the law should be entirely invalidated, entirely struck down, and because we can think of particular cases where the legislature might have an interest, we're not going to eliminate it entirely. So, for example, if you are the lawyer for the legislature, they may have an interest in the case, and so we don't want to say that the law is entirely gone. So what we said is, okay, well then we're going to challenge not the entirety of the law, but the way it applies in certain cases, which is why I talked about these two categories of cases. So we actually originally asked the state Supreme Court to take that case up directly. And the court declined to do that, so we went through the process. We went to circuit court, and we got a favorable ruling. It then went to the Court of Appeals, and it got reversed. And then it went to the state Supreme Court, and now it has been, the Court of Appeals was overturned. So those two categories of cases are struck down. So the law is still on the books, and it still has some applications, but not in these categories. How was that for you, Jeff?
I kind of got it, but that's why I'm relying on you. Okay, Jimmy. So the question is about crypto and fraud.
Yeah, so I'll touch on both crypto and AI as well. So first on crypto, as you're probably well aware, DFI recently put something out on this topic. So that's one recent development. I know that there are also, there's at least one and probably multiple legislators who are working on legislation relating to this topic. But one of the things that we try to do at DOJ as issues come to our attention is to raise awareness about potential types of fraud and other concerns that consumers may have. I know Iowa, for example, has taken some action on this topic recently. But I think you're right that this is something that folks need to be aware of, that cryptocurrency machines are in a lot of cases being used in connection with fraud. And it also is part of a broader topic, which is there are lots of types of fraud out there that are trying to trick people into thinking they need to send money to help a family member or because of some other crisis. And the more that we can raise awareness about this, the better. This is a topic where awareness is especially important because enforcement is very difficult. A lot of the crime is being committed from folks overseas, and so getting accountability that way it can be challenging, not impossible, but challenging. And the volume is unfortunately really high. And so the more that we can raise awareness, the better. In terms of AI, that's an area that I'm very concerned about right now because part of the federal legislation pending would prohibit states from regulating AI for a decade. I don't know that the next decade will be the most important decade in AI, but it certainly seems like it could be critically important, and requiring states to remain on the sidelines is very concerning. I am hopeful that Congress reconsiders that, but if we are left without any ability to enforce AI, it would be the Wild West on that topic for a decade, and that would lead to enormous harm for people. It's one of the many, many, many reasons that this bill pending is really problematic.
That seems to be a bipartisan concern. Okay, go ahead, Ron.
I understand we have an Attorney General of the United States
How's Pam Bondi doing?
Well, I could spend more time than we have left, I think, weighing in on that topic. I'm deeply concerned about the shift in, we talked about this before, but the shift in DOJ priorities away from prioritizing the most significant crimes, the ones that have the most impact on people, number one. Number two, I understand that the AG had some involvement, or at least the DOJ had some involvement in the acceptance of a plane from Qatar, $400 million plane, which is just shocking, I think. And then I'm concerned about some of the actions we've seen from this department. And I briefly touched on the New Jersey case before, but charging a mayor and then dismissing the charges within a matter of weeks is, at best, a sign of incompetence, but I think much more concerning, a sign of weaponization of the Department of Justice. This is not necessarily Pam Bondi, but, well, it is the Department of Justice, though. What we saw with the handling of the Eric Adams case is incredibly disturbing. It relates, this is not DOJ, but the president's use of the pardon authority is very concerning. And, what you see in countries that do not have the kind of history of freedom that we do is use of the justice system as a tool to help those who are favored to the party in power and to disfavor those who are not favored by the party in power. That's what we're seeing play out from this administration. And that to me is fundamentally inconsistent with how the AG, but also the administration generally, should be handling their job.
Okay, so you used to be a federal prosecutor. You must still have colleagues in the system, or have they all left?
No, there are certainly folks I used to work with who are still there.
So what are they? Are they alarmed? Are they annoyed? Are they? What's their state of mind?
Well, I obviously don't want to speak for specific individuals, but I take a look at what's happening with the FBI. This is not prosecutors, but investigators. We have seen the leadership of the FBI be removed. We've seen this effort to purge FBI agents who were involved in the investigation into the events of January 6th. What we are seeing is concerning, and what you saw in the Eric Adams case was federal prosecutors step down rather than move forward with what the administration suggested. That happened in Kentucky recently with the Abreu Garcia case, where a federal prosecutor stepped down. This is not the kind of thing you see normally. These are people who are in these positions in a lot of cases for their careers, or at least for a long time. But it's another red alarm about what's happening with this administration and its attack on the rule of law and our system of justice.
So the Democratic AGs, you said you were prepared for some of these things. Were Dem AGs around the country, were you communicating between November and Inauguration Day, okay, what are we going to do?
In any situation, we're preparing for what's coming down the road. And so following the election, we knew that there were going to be significant changes to policy. Some of them were ones that I believe and we believed would be unconstitutional or unlawful. And there's actually a handy playbook that laid out a lot of what the administration has done. It's called Project 2025. And so a lot of what has happened was identified beforehand. A lot of it was not, but a lot of it was. So we mentioned the birthright citizenship change, for example. That's one example. But dismantling the Department of Education was another example. We have been in communication to make sure we're prepared for what would be happening. And I think what you've seen with these cases we've been filing is that we have been prepared. And we've had a lot of damage stopped as a result of these cases. So there was an effort to dismantle the Department of Education. That's blocked right now because of one of those cases. Same thing with birthright citizenship. Same thing with some of the other cuts we've talked about. So we have been prepared. But there have certainly been surprises from this administration as well. And so sometimes we're responding in real time. One thing, though, that I think is important to note is, I talked about Project 2025. What we have seen is really Project 2025 on steroids, because in a lot of areas, the administration has gone beyond what Project 2025 suggested. So with USAID, for example, it has been gutted in a way that goes even beyond what was predicted there. So if anything, I think what we've seen is more extreme than what we anticipated based on what had been discussed before.
Okay. Sorry I interrupted the question asking. Anybody else have any other questions? There you go.
That's a great question.
Other than reading WisPolitics, that helps give you solace, I'm sure. What do you do to relax after a bad day at the office?
So it's a good opportunity to talk about. A lot of what we've been talking about is the federal litigation for good reason. That's really important right now. But I don't want to overlook the fact that there's actually a lot of great stuff that is happening in the state of Wisconsin. So one area, for instance, is with regard to the opioid epidemic. One of the things we did a few months after I took office was file suit against Purdue Pharma. We also joined in a multi-state investigation into opioid distributors. And through our work, as well as the work of cities and states around the country and counties and others, we have now helped to secure over $800 million that's going to go to support efforts to combat the opioid epidemic in the state of Wisconsin.
And the curve is bending.
And for the first time in a while, we started to see a reduction in opioid-related overdose deaths. And I've had the opportunity to be at groundbreakings, for example, for new treatment facilities, to hear about the impact that Narcan is having in helping to save lives. It's one of many examples where there's good stuff happening. And so being able to be part of that is great to see. I will also say it's always encouraging and heartening to talk to folks from around the state. When you talk to people, if you read the news, you watch politics, you see division, you see a lot of discord. That's what gets a lot of news. But when you talk to people everywhere you go, they care about their families, they care about their neighbors, they care about their communities, about our state. They want to make a positive difference for others. And that is really heartening and encouraging and something that I find to be really inspiring as I go about my work.
So I don't know whether that was a planted question, but that was a pretty good ending to the program. So I give you Attorney General Josh Kaul, everybody. Thank you to our sponsors, Walmart, WC Energy Group, AARP Wisconsin, Wisconsin Insurance Alliance, AmFam Insurance, and HB Strategies, and Xcel Energy. Thanks, everybody, and remember to give me your suggestions for future programs. And thanks again, Mr. Attorney General.
As the state's leading property and casualty insurance trade association, the Wisconsin Insurance Alliance plays a crucial role in safeguarding Wisconsinites. Alliance members provide vital insurance coverage, ensuring financial protection for individuals, businesses, and communities across the state. In times of need, they act as a reliable resource, helping residents recover from unforeseen events. Ultimately, the Wisconsin Insurance Alliance and its members contribute to the resilience and well-being of Wisconsin families and businesses by offering essential protection and support. You have been watching a production of Wisconsin Eye, your unfiltered window into legislative deliberations and public policy programming, where our mission is to provide Wisconsinites an opportunity to access the legislative process and connect with conversations that inform our citizenry. Please consider supporting our mission, and thank you for watching. Wisconsin Eye, policy made public.